Chapter 2, Along the Edge of the Abyss. Now it has been 20 days since the caravels went sailing, breaking through the coming waves. Yes, 20 days since then are past. Since the arrows of the compass showed not maps, but showed a path. Singing these ancient words to the tune of Plowed Paradise, Sheridan burst into the round hall, saw Phirotis leaning over the reading machine, and was embarrassed. I am going into the thinking of the EDW, Chetty explained. Today is precisely 20 days since we slowed down and have since been hanging motionlessly in space. But do not ye think the words of Phirotis were accompanied by her usual gliding smile, that the tune of Plowed Paradise does not harmonically fit the poetry of the EDW? D. Ramir, who recently created that cantata, is an advocate of the somber red-orange melodic spectrum. And it seems to me that EDW poets were good people because, even in such conditions, they managed to create good, kind works of the cyan spectrum. Ye know from those times I admire Russian poetry the most. It is, in my view, the most profound, courageous, and human among the poetic heritage of the whole world of that time. Good people always carried the sadness of an ill-ordered, infernal life, and the melodies of their songs would not have been more major than the green spectrum. But the surviving recordings of music, Chetty objected, abound, even with yellow melodic lines. This is so, but don't forget, Chetty, during your transformation into a girl of the EDW, that in the artistic works of that time, two sides were always separated, inner and outer. They knew how to express the inner only indirectly, and the outer was a mask in the yellow, orange, and even infrared spectrums of melody. It was also called abstract, as it were, super-emotional music. Did the mask also serve the requirements of society or power? Often, but not necessarily. Like any mask, it mainly covered the gap between the aspirations of the artist and life that he had to lead. But then everyone wore masks, said Cheridan, surprised. Indeed, it was so. Those rare few who tried to live without masks were considered madmen, saints, or so-called fools, the term used at the time for non-aggressive people with defective thinking. And is it proven? Of course not. Little is known about the inner life of people of that era, and the distortion of ideas is always possible, but, excuse me, I interrupted ye. Ye have a greater knowledge of the EDW and selection, will ye sing to me? Something that ye especially like. Phirotis leaned her elbows on the table, chin resting in her palms. She remained in this position for several minutes, and then began to sing in a strong, fair voice. No, not a reproach, not an omen, these heavenly moments and pure, into balance, with calm, steady motion, the wavering heart's scales came sure. Chetty suppressed a sigh of admiration. A moment between light and shadow, a day between winter and spring, with my all I submit to the movement of the song to my sails that is wind. In the cyan spectrum? Asked Chetty. Green. I took a melody from Indifferent Goddess. A moment between light and shadow. Chetty repeated the line thoughtfully. A beautiful notion. I will remember it forever. And how it fits with our future path on the verge between the starry expanses of Shakti and the abyss of Tamas. A moment between light and shadow, but this is our dark flame. I hadn't thought of it that way, said Rhodus. Only the inner meaning of the song sounded for me, and it reflected the present. A not infrequent coincidence in the moment of a deep feeling, Phirotis fell once again into deep thought. Cheridan slipped away quietly into the circular corridor, where she almost collided with some fellow crew members. Come along with us, Chetty, Menticor invited. We're off to dance. Today the work went well. We laid the last cochlear program, but inside everything is boiling with tension. All right, I'll just call for a partner, answered Chetty. Griff Rift. And she raised the dial of the signal bracelet in front of her. Menticor covered it with his hand. No need. He's up on the veranda. Menticor hesitated, lowering his eyes. Why bother Rift? I think he is ruminating on the greatest problems. Exactly the reason to distract him. It seems you don't know what he lived through. Griff Rift lost his beloved. She died at the unsealing of an ancient warehouse of biological poisons. Our ancestors stocked them in quantities sufficient to poison the entire planet. The wisdom of the people of EMH saved everyone from a terrible catastrophe at the cost of just one life. But this life was most precious to Rift. Chedidan approached the elevator door, which obligingly opened in front of her. Veranda was the name given to the space under the dome around the spheroid of the pilot's cabin. It was used as a walking platform and gymnasium. There, Tavisa Heneko and Torlik were already rushing vigorously and frenetically. Chedidan saw Rift leaning against the railing of the gallery and staring at the reflective silver surface of the gymnastics pool. Filled with a transformed thallium isotope, non-toxic and non-volatile, it served for complex exercises in conditions of both regular and high gravity. Chedi led the engineer down, and the somber commander of the starship smiled involuntarily, looking down into the flushed face of the girl. They danced slowly and silently. Chedi felt the strained movements of Griffrift begin to loosen and become freer. "Just a few more days, and they will have all the necessary data," said Chedi, nodding towards the exercising astronavigators. "Then it's down to business for ye." Chedi sighed. "They say that there is nothing worse than entering zero space." "Maybe. I will find a place for ye in the pilot's cabin. There is a small chair behind the velocity indicator cooler. After all, the sociologist must glimpse the roots of the universe, merciless and deadly for life, flying in its black depths, like a seagull in a night hurricane. But flying, even so. Yes, and in this resides the greatest mystery of life and its meaninglessness. Matter, generating within itself the potential to unveil the secret of itself, accumulating information about itself. A snake eating its own tail. Ye speak like an ancient man who lived a narrow life, small and without the joy of cognition. All of us, like those of 30,000 years ago, proved to be narrow and small. We barely come face to face with the mercilessness of the world. I do not believe it. Now we are much more integrated, dissolved, with thousands of spiritually close people. It seems that nothing is frightening, even death, the traceless disappearance of such a small drop as me. Although, forgive me, I talk only about myself. I do not feel in ye a second cycle teacher. But do ye know what a terrible word never is, and how difficult it is to come to peace with it? It is intolerable, and I am convinced that has always been so. Since man began with his memory to resurrect the past, and with his imagination to look into the future. And the world is built so that never is repeated at every moment of life. Perhaps this is the only inevitable repetition. Perhaps a true human is only the one who has found the strength in himself to combine depth of feeling with this merciless never. Before, and even now, many have tried to resolve this contradiction through struggle against feeling. If never awaits, if love and friendship are nothing more than processes with inevitable ends, then vows of love eternal, of friendship forever, to which our ancestors so clung, are naive and unreal. Consequently, the more coldness in the relationship, the better. This corresponds to the true structure of the world. Can you not see how little this corresponds to a human? Indeed, at its very base, a human is designed as a protest against never, Griffrift answered. I hadn't thought about that, Chedi admitted. Then accept the struggle of emotions against the momentariness of life, the merciless infinity of the universe as natural, as one of the coordinates of a human. But if a human combines the depth of feelings and never, do not be surprised at his sadness. Chedidan looked with inspiration into the face of the engineer, bowed towards hers, and gently stroked his large hand. Come on! Griffrift said abruptly and led her up to the second deck, towards his spacious cabin. The engineer turned on the gray light used to examine color ratios and pushed back a light panel in the wall. A plastic hologram resurrected the image of the one that remained the same only in the memory of Griffrift. A young woman in a broad white dress sat, bare arms folded in her lap and face slightly raised, traced by a crescent-shaped frame of carefully combed blonde hair. A smooth, rounded forehead, thin, slanting eyebrows, and cheerful, mischievous eyes were in harmony with the playful outline of a full, large mouth. A high neck, embraced by several rows of pink pearls, descending into a plunging neckline according to the fashion of recent years. Her entire figure exuded a light, youthful joy. It was as if the sprite of spring of the undying folk tales of mankind had manifested in the cabin of the starship so as to convey to the astronauts that particular presentiment of the fulfilling happiness that is peculiar only to very young in the midst of spring, imbued with all the aromas, the warm glare of the sun, and the fresh wind of the earth. With this feeling, Chetty quietly left the cabin when Griffith extinguished the stereoplastic portrait and stood in the gray light, silent and motionless. And Chetty fought with welling tears and a lump of nerves in her throat, astonished at how strongly she had been affected by her meeting with the deceased beloved of the renowned engineer. A sociologist of the epoch of Methans, she said to herself, "What is happening with you? Is it that you are truly becoming a woman of EDW, uncontrollably pitying, sensitive to any suffering? You must think, will this be useful in difficult days when you must plunge into the life of Tormans?" She had long since decided that her role on the planet would be that of an ordinary Tormansian, not a guest, not a teacher, but rather a student. To immerse, to integrate, not to differ, to get lost in the crowds of the folk seen in the pictures of the Cephians. To judge not from without, but from within, the main commandment of a sociologist of higher forms of social structure. Phairodis had approved her project on the sole condition that the final decision would be made on Tormans. Griffith kept his promise. Chetty sank into the depths of the chair. All the places in the pilot's cabin were occupied. In the center of the semicircle of consoles sat Griffith, a little behind and to the right of Div Symbol, looking like a stone statue of a wrestler. To the left, Solsan focused his narrowed eyes on the top row of the screens. The cheekbones of his dry face jutted sharply, and a deep line ran across his chin from one cheek to another. Both astronavigators, with a look of cool indifference, trying to show that everything was under control, settled behind the left end of the console. From her position, Chetty Down could see the profile of Phairodis, who was sitting in the guest chair 2 meters behind the Annihilator engineer. Outwardly, the head of the expedition seemed perfectly calm, but could not deceive the perceptive Chetty, who noticed that Phai was anxious. Her first time too, Chetty thought, looking back at the firmly locked door. The rest of the crew, except for General Atal, was in a biosecurity chamber under the watch of Naya Hawley and Evisa Tanit. Gen Atal had isolated himself in a cramped cabin under the main dome above the pilot's cabin, to where, as to a pole, the lines of power stresses, temperature deformation, and reflectors of the negative field spherical condensations converged. Sheridan's fervent imagination envisioned the armor engineer as an ancient warrior, poised behind a shield, ready to fend off all the unexpected blows of the enemy. In essence, this was precisely the case, only instead of the hilt of the sword and dagger, the fingers of the engineer clasped the levers of much more powerful instruments. The silence was broken by 3 notes of the PSE chord. Griffith turned to Solsan and signaled to him. The song of the PSE fell still. The silence became so deep that the flashing of the surrounding screens seemed to rustle and ring in the handfuls of bright stars to their left, towards the galactic center. The tangled threads of the needle-shaped luminaries stretched to the right along the outer sleeve of our universe. At the second signal of Griffith, Div Symbol turned the starship. The wildly disheveled nebula of luminous gas, the edge of the cloud of dark matter illuminated by the dense fire of a globular cluster, and the long strands of scattered light in Cygnus slowly left the front screens. The blackness of the cosmic night closed in, casting into the immeasurable distance the dim lights of distant stars and galaxies. This meant that the nose of the ship had turned towards the constellation Lynx and was approaching the Repagulum, a kind of partition separating part of the revolution of the world and the anti-world, Shakti and Tamas, nested one into the other. Div Symbol spun a small red wheel, mounted on a cone protruding from the console. The spaceship shook. A slight acceleration pressed Chetty into the back of the chair. The lower edges of the screens flickered, extinguishing the sharp starry lights with the glow of a neutrino vortex. Griffith flicked a switch. A piercing signal swept through all the rooms of the ship, and a blue flame flashed on the screens, causing Chetty and Phairodis to flinch. Both women instinctively covered their eyes with their hands until they had acclimatized to the change of colors, cyan and blue, rapidly swirling, flowing around the dome of the starship. Darkness fell in the pilot's cabin as if it had plunged into a lake of black, covered from above by a bowl of swift streams of light. 4 gigantic round dials lit up one above the other on the vertical partition separating the 2 screens at the top of the console arc. Griffith nodded towards Div Symbol, and the pilot engineer hurriedly turned the red wheel back. Chidi-dan guessed rather than felt the rotation of the spheroid of the pilot's cabin. The dials flickered with a rush of orange lights, and their huge arrows moved to the left, quaking and swaying at random. Griffrift leaned over the console, and his hands, lit only by the glare of the dials, flew over the instrument keys with the virtuosity of a first-class pianist. The arrows slowly leveled off, one after the other ceasing their erratic flutter, and darkness began to creep over the starboard screens. It was not the night darkness of the Earth, filled with air, smells, and sounds of life, and not the darkness of the outer cosmos, the blackness of which always implies immense space. Onto the spaceship crawled something that did not answer to feelings and reason, not endowed with any of those properties familiar to man, and not even amenable to abstract definition. It was not matter and not space, not emptiness or cloud. Something in which all the sensations of a person simultaneously drowned and rested, causing the deepest horror. Chedi-dan grabbed onto the chair and gritted her teeth, gripped by primitive fear. Trembling, she fastened her gaze onto the long stern face of Griffrift, firmly fixed on his instruments. The 4 dials above his head now burned with a dim yellow flame. The points of the arrows stood out sharply, 2 up, 2 down, inching towards the vertical line. As soon as the arrows touched this feature, the spaceship shook. For a second, a grandiose spectacle unfolded in front of Chedi's eyes. Stellar clouds, streaks, and spheres burning with dagger-like rays all the way up the vertical column of dials, and on the left, a screen of darkness saturating the entire wall. And suddenly everything went out. The sense of collapsing, falling into the abyss without support and salvation was crushed into the fading consciousness of Chedi. An indescribably tormenting sensation of an internal nervous explosion made her scream hysterically and meaninglessly. In reality, Chedi only moved her lips soundlessly. To her it seemed that her whole being was evaporating, like a drop of water. Then an icy chill bound her in the depths of that abyss in which she was falling without end. With a feeling of the integrity of the body, consciousness returned to Chedi. Trickles of the tonic gas mixture quietly coiled around her sweat-covered face. Slowly, fearing she would not survive a second collapse of consciousness, Chedi squinted, trying to focus on the starboard screens. Nothing could be seen on them except a turbid and gray emptiness. To the left, where the luminiferous power of the millions of suns of the center of the galaxy had shone before, there was also a gray nothingness. Chedi met eyes with Phi Rotis, who smiled weakly and, noticing that Chedi wanted to say something, put her finger to her lips. Griffrift, Div Symbol, and Soul Sign moved their seats. In the triangle of their shoulders and heads shone a low, transparent, like crystal, column. Inside it, a mercury-like liquid flowed in a subtle spiral. The slightest slowdown or acceleration of its flow caused a jump in one of the arrows of the large dials, and the sharp, demanding blast of a horn from somewhere at the foot of the control panel. With each blast, all 3 heads would shudder, tensing and again fall into entrancement as soon as the arrow returned to the line. A particularly insistent blast sounded. 2 arrows moved simultaneously. On the starboard screen from the gray haze, a blur of darkness emerged. Chedi knew enough about the new views on the structure of the universe to understand this blur of darkness to be the ledge of Tormans. She knew that the gravitational fields in our universe have very diverse shapes, most often tops, vortexes, highly flattened cones, stretched in chains in the directions of space-time anisotropy. It was not surprising that the anti-gravity fields of the anti-world for us, that is, the gravity of Tormans, should be constructed analogously, and that behind this undulating protrusion existed thickets of antimatter black galaxies and the invisible suns of Tormans. It once seemed inconceivable to people that inhabited worlds could appear in neighboring galaxies, such as the Andromeda Nebula. And even earlier, heads spun at the idea of life on the planets of Arcturus or Altair. Now for mankind, the endless space of his own universe, with its billions of galaxies, was not enough, and he approached the terrifying darkness of the anti-world, which, as it turned out, was not far away at all. But what kind of courage and thirst for knowledge must be accumulated by people in order not only to stand fearlessly before the wall of horror, but also to strive to break through it into that for which an ordinary person, like Chedi herself, does not even have a mental definition. And yet she had almost mustered the nerve to teach life lessons to Griff Rift himself. No, she had spoken to him well, with friendly understanding and a unity of feelings. A moment between light and shadow, the song of Rhodas sounded in her memory. Indeed, a moment. The vertical bar with the dials represents the verge. Slip from it, and she now knows what will happen in Tormans. You could find yourself in our world, the bright Shakti, but it is also deadly to come too close to a star or a globular cluster. In the same way, one speeds along the crest of a wave, with the difference that a far greater fate stood behind the flight of the dark flame and the 13 lives of its crew. Griff Rift had spoken of a seagull flying in a night hurricane. He should know. For him, this was no poetic analogy, but the exact image of the DBS. No, enough! The merciless roots of the universe were too scary for her, nurtured in the caring society of the Earth. She was curious to know the feelings of Rhodas. There she was, motionless as the three around the crystal column, raising her eyes to the screens behind which was the gray void. Was she too trying to imagine Tormans? Chetty had not guessed the thoughts of Rhodas. The feelings experienced by her had been far more painful than those of Chetty, as Rhodas had not lost consciousness. Her strong, superbly trained body had resisted the transition into zero space in much the same way as the DBS pilots. Having swiftly returned to normal, she was now thinking of the room at the Kinrook Institute in eastern Canada, where she had prepared for the expedition. Spacious, a wall glazed by huge sheets of silicalum, the room overlooked the valley of a large river among the pine forests of a reserve. Rhodas recalled the most insignificant details, from the fawn hue of the solid carpet to the large tables and silk gray sofas of synthetic wood. Warm comfort was conducive to the work, especially when behind the transparent wall facing the distant river, low clouds crawled and cold rains were swept in on the wind. Then Rhodas would climb onto the sofa at the opposite end of the room, near the reading apparatus and piles of restored ancient films, to read, to think, and to watch. A happy time to absorb information in order to make herself capable of understanding the ancient historical processes and paths of the ascension of mankind. Once she came across a piece of a film about the war. A mushroom of water and steam from a nuclear explosion unfurled over the ocean, reaching up to the sky above the hills and palm groves of a steep coast. Several ships had capsized and scattered. From a coastal fortification, two people observed the events. Elderly and overweight, wearing identical caps with golden symbols, obviously commanders. Their faces, lit by the glow of a sea fire, riddled with wrinkles, with swollen lids of tired eyes, expressed no fear, only concentrated attention. Both had large features, massive jaws, portraying a matching sense of confidence in the successful outcome of the Titanic battle. Rhodas remembered how, standing at the window, peering into the black night behind the transparent wall, she had thought of the ocean of courage it must have taken for the people of Earth to bring themselves out of that wild state and transform their planet into a bright, blooming garden. 90 billion people passed under the scythe of time, beginning with flimsy huts on tree branches or narrow crevices and cliffs, until the victory of reason and knowledge, with the advent of an all-planet communist society, ended the night of affliction that had long haunted humanity. A monstrous price, but now the proud woman was shocked and, to honestly confess, scared by this confrontation with the reality of the universe, scared no less than her sisters, long passed from the face of the planet, who had once succumbed to fear. Fear in the face of reality, leading to a break with it, to the creation of illusions and the distortion of real life, always possessed a person who was not toughened from childhood to contend with the forces of nature. Even she, full of health, specially trained psychically, trembled before the fundamental structures of the true world. But the faces of her comrades were firm and adamant in the struggle against the forces of the anti-world, before which not only a person, but even an entire galaxy is but a speck of dust disappearing without a trace into the hostile darkness of Tormans, anti-time and anti-space. Rhodas looked at the three fearless pilots of the ship sitting in front of her and asked herself, where is the limit and is there one? With the invention of the DBS came the era of met hands, and what will replace it in the future? The era of the unification of Shakti and Tormans, balancing the roots of a bipolar universe? But how to avoid short-circuit, structurelessness, annihilation? Even vague guesses about this were beyond her power of reckoning. and suddenly the crystal column extinguished. A new sound, like a bass string chord, echoed in the floor of the cabin. Phaerotis instinctively realized that the dark flame had reached her objective, or rather, the exit point. Something again befell her body. Falling or taking off, stretching or shrinking, Phaerotis couldn't work it out. All the usual sensations disappeared. It was as if she was floating in weightlessness, feeling neither cold nor warmth, neither bottom nor top, light nor darkness. Having lost all reference points, the brain refused to perceive anything. Monotonous thoughts began to spin in a circle, chasing one another in an endless series of repetitions. She felt neither fear nor joy, did not understand her condition, similar to a life already born and yet meaningless, like billions of years ago. But the unknown invaded the reeling, monotonous thoughts, broke their closed chain. Consciousness again opened its arms to the outside world, returning from non-48 being. No, this state could not be called non-being. Rhodas was, but did not exist, or rather existed, but was not. She saw a magnificent speckling of starlights. Only the belts and globes of burning matter now went to the bottom of the port side screens. Up ahead, on the right, in the blackness of the cosmos, the constellation of the 5 red suns ominously shone, with 2 pale stars close by. Griff Rift rose, ran his hands over his face, as if washing away fatigue. Div Symbol manipulated the digital discs on the control panel. The spaceship shuddered several times, like a calming beast, and then stilled. Joy, indeterminable and deep, warmed Phaerotis. As one who has wandered in a baleful dungeon comes out to a blue sky, a warm sun, the living smell of grass and forest. She smiled at everyone, Griff Rift, Chetty, and the 2 astronavigators making their way along the consoles to the elevator and into the room of computers. Gen Adal appeared from somewhere in front of the oval door. He pulled a green lever, and the massive door slid open. The armor protection engineer and Griff Rift both approached Chetty. "Done," said Rift. "Now it's up to the astronavigators. Soon they will tell us how close we have come to the target." "What do you think, Div?" The pilot engineer pointed to a dim star, 4 to 5 centimeters in diameter, half hidden by the screen frame, and previously unseen by Phaerotis. "If this is the sun of Tormans, and it is the size of ours, then it can be only 300–400 million kilometers away. This is nothing." "And if it isn't it? If it's one of those 5? Asked Solsane. "Then we will have to wander for a long time. Or, again, enter zero space, but without a net prepared in advance on Earth. This would spell trouble, but I trust both the calculations of Earth and our astronavigators." "This is not their first DBS expedition," said Div Symbol calmly. Chetty Dunn carefully lowered her legs to the firm floor. "How do you feel, Chetty?" Griff Rift asked caringly. "Maybe we call Iviza? After all, we took a risk exposing ye to such a test." "I had hoped for a thorough training of our entire crew. And ye were not mistaken." Chetty straightened up, struggling to overcome the weakness in her legs and the flickering before her eyes. The 3 starship pilots exchanged glances of approval. She responds as if losing consciousness twice in a short period of time was commonplace for her. Chetty caught a laughsome glint in the dark eyes of Solsane. "Why do ye not worry about Phaerotis? She too has entered zero space for the first time." "Nobody worries about Phaerotis." Griff Rift lowered his voice. "Not only has she conducted excavations on distant planets, but she has also gone through all 10 stages of infernality." "What for?" Che Da'an was stunned. Historians do this in order to more deeply understand the feelings of people of the ancient past. Chetty turned pink from an influx of blended feelings. For the second time in the cramped little world of 13 people, she had underestimated the historian. Certainly, one can't consider oneself a sociologist earlier than 50 years of age. It is good that machine linguistics was an area in which she could believe in herself. How many more surprises would be brought to her with further work alongside her expedition comrades? She went back to her cabin, casting a sidelong glance at Phaerotis. Leaning against the back of the chair, she looked out the window at the unkind flicker of the constellation of the red suns. Suddenly, Chetty recalled a painting she had seen once at art exhibition. A wretched landscape, ridges of gray-brown stone, slimy and covered with winding strips of dirty brown vegetation, long, creeping algae-like tassels. As if by columns, the low, clouded sky seemed held up by rows of red-rusted, open-work towers. On the beams of the closest of the mysterious buildings hung the same brown tatters, swept to the side by a persistent and uniform wind. In front, close up, a woman in a complex spacesuit was depicted. The upper part of the helmet, raised in the manner taken from the ancient knights, revealed part of her face. From the characteristic contours of the forehead, the bridge of the nose, eyebrows, and eyes, Chetty now unmistakably recognized Phairodis, although her nose, mouth, and chin were hidden in the complex respiratory device. Yes, of course she had been there on the wet planets of the infrared suns. Consequently, the short penultimate leap of Nogan had taken place with the participation of Phairodis, and she had kept silent in order that Chetty and her comrades, never having been in zero space, would not feel themselves as green newcomers in front of her. There was much that Chetty did not yet know. However, Phairodis herself did not suspect that at this very moment, among the mountains of Ciscaucasia, the author of the painting, a famous astronomer, was sitting at a gigantic telescope. Invigorating himself with anti-sleeping pills, he was on watch for the third night. In front of him, 1,000,000 times amplified, the red dots of the 5-star cluster in the constellation Lynx flickered on a screen. Somewhere out there, maybe this insignificant red light above the cluster, thousands of years away on the path of the light ray, the dark flame would emerge. Aboard was the unforgettable Phairodis, the many images of whom could now be destroyed in his memory only by death. Precisely at that moment in the spheroid of the pilot's cabin, Phairodis and Griffrift regarded the same scarlet star. The engineer-pilot had guessed correctly. The dim light, which appeared on the screen as a small disk, was indeed the sun of Tormans. Virnorine and Manticore quickly determined the distance. 380 million kilometers were to be covered by the starship on animazon motors, ordinary space engines. If the starship was not completely inhibited, and traveled at least with the so-called approach speed of 0.1 L, then she would reach Tormans in exactly 3.5 hours. But acceleration and then deceleration of the dark flame required about 30 more hours. A signal sounded triumphantly, driving the people into the amortizational cabins of magnetic shafts. The dark flame raced in leaps and bounds along a new course. Even before the advent of the DBS, ordinary starships equipped with magnetic inertia dampers received the nickname of star kangaroos precisely for this ability of incredibly rapid acceleration. Div Symbol and Sol Sane set up the ship's automatic controllers, which would take them through acceleration, flight, and deceleration in a single cycle. The entire crew, immersed in a hypnotic sleep that tempered the discomfort, did not leave the amortizational cabins. No one on the ship, except for traveling footage and robot journals, could observe how the scarlet sun swelled, changing coloration, becoming increasingly red. At first it grew slowly, then it began to approach with menacing speed, pouring its fiery power out onto the starship. Reaching almost 2 meters across, it no longer looked like a flat disk, but like a sphere in a widely spread luminous mantle. It receded as quickly as the ship passed through the Anasteria, and soon appeared equal in size to the sun visible from Earth. The starship finished describing an exact curve. Her speed fell to the designated minimum. In a separate small cabin, where Div Symbol and Virnorine were dozing, apparatuses were launched that would wake the attendants in case of any malfunction in the PEC. It was not long until all 13 had gathered in the pilot spheroid, looking out at the approaching planet. The second from its star and much closer to it than the Earth to the Sun, it also had only one remote satellite of equatorial circulation. The astronavigators knew well the pure cyan of their native planet, which became brighter and more joyful as it was approached. Tormans, though, turned out to be deep blue, and where the condensations of the cloud cover reflected and scattered the rays of the red sun less strongly, purple. In the thickness of the color of the planet, there was a whisper of hostility. People more nervous than the star pilots might have felt something sinister in the appearance of the planet. A dark blue orb hung in the black sky, and under it, barely noticeable, sailed the ash disk of a satellite. Still, Tormans was probably the third planet at one point, Torlik said loudly. The first will have long ago collapsed into its star, as it will be with our Mercury. This star is older. The astrophysicist fell silent, looking at the receiving screen of the front locators, traced by a dotted arc. Griff rushed towards the console, but Oladez got there first and turned on the connection. Short vertical columns ran in a long window under the locator, and the translation machine began to sing two notes, re and so, echoing them without interruption. "The language of the circle!" Griff exclaimed. Oladez moved the index of the translation machine. Immediately in the window of aperture ran the numbers 02, 02, 02, 02, the galactic call signals of the stations of the Great Circle. The starship was being called. Some incredibly sensitive locators had detected the approach of the dark flame, and now spoke to her in a language common to millions of galaxy planets and extragalactic star clusters, united in the mighty alliance of the Great Circle. Even the M31 galaxy, or the Andromeda Nebula, now with the help of direct beam starships, adjoins the colossal power of its collective mind reason, its circle, to ours, and this is only the very beginning of the new era EMH. This basic, conditional language, deciphered by a son of Earth, the exceptional Kamamat, was preparing to sound in the standard symbols of the planet Tormans. But then how wrong were the earthly ideas about it? If the Tormansians have entered the circle, know its language, and communicate with their brothers in reason, then there is no planet of torment. It was a myth, an error of accidental misunderstanding. Perhaps the thinking of the Cephians was too different from the inhabitants of the constellation Draco, who sent the DBS to the 26th region of the 8th Revolution, and this could not be verified by the station of the Great Circle, which transmitted a message to Earth. To Cheridan, it seemed that in the starship, the hopeful, emboldening winds of their distant home planet blew. Instead of knocking on the door of an inhospitable, possibly hostile planet, they come as invited guests, equals before equals. Everything would be clear to the Tormansians, and in vain were apprehensions of hurting or being hurt by mistrust and fear. Chetty's comrades shared her joy. Only in the astute face of Oladez was there a momentary flash of disappointment. Out of an unconscious desire to emulate Phairodis, Cheridan looked first of all to her, catching the look of joyful relief, almost triumph, thrown to Griffrift. Phairodis leaned back slightly so as not to turn away from the screens, and gave Griffrift her hand in such a gesture that Chetty was delighted. She had never yet looked at the head of the expedition as a woman, especially next to such brilliant representatives of her sex as Oyadez and Avisa Tenet. And now in Rhodus, the tenderness of the mother, the kindness of the doctor, and the joy of recognizing oneself as beautiful seemed to have united. The run of digital signals behind the receiver glass continued for a set number of minutes, followed by a string of different characters. A harsh, weakly modulated voice, typical for small-sized translation machines, slowly pronounced, "Attention, one and all, everybody. A travel message is being transmitted." Chetty went cold and looked around helplessly. With lightning speed, Phairodis bent down over the receiver, and Griffrift clenched into a fist the hand which had just held the fingers of the triumphant Rhodus. Expedition travel message being transmitted from the planet. The machine seemed to choke, making a few inaudible sounds, and continued, as before, pertly and dispassionately. "We have set a galactic coordinate reference and a warning on the uninhabited satellite of the populated planet. Listen first to the warning. O2, 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 listen to the warning." "Oh," sighed someone, with all the bitterness of dismay, as soon as the machine fell silent for a second. "Warning about oxygen life. Do not land. The planet is inhabited by a humanoid civilization of high density, a THI, technical height index, of approximately 36, not included in the GC. Request to accept starship sent in their language was immediately denied. They do not want visitors. Do not land on the planet." The machine paused a second time, and on the window crawled icons and numbers, unnecessary for those who already knew the coordinates of Earthlings. They stood in silence until the notes and numbers of galactic call signals were repeated again. "Everything is clear!" Oladez turned off the receiver. "Yes," said the astronavigator joylessly. "There is a bomb station on the satellite. Still working properly after 3 centuries. Well done, Cephians. Actually, were it not for them," began Oladez. "We would not be here," said Solsheim, laughing dryly at the tension they had just lived through. The crew began to move about and talk, trying to hide their disappointment from each other. "Attention, everybody. Griff stopped talking and turned to Phi Rotis. "What is the plan?" "As before, without changes," she replied, returning to her former calm and firm self. "Should we first approach the satellite?" Griff asked, "now that the message of the Cephians has confirmed its uninhabitedness. And yet, it is necessary. With our experience, we can see what was not noticed, and therefore not understood by the Cephians. Perhaps, on the satellite are remnant structures of the former civilization of Tormans, which only subsequently fell into decay. On the planet, there may have existed an even more ancient civilization, extinct or exterminated by the modern inhabitants of Tormans if they are aliens." Griff nodded, silently agreeing. The dark flame slowly approached the satellite, and, equalizing their orbital speeds, began to circle the lifeless sphere of about 600 kilometers in diameter, like Mimas of Saturn. Powerful stereo telescopes probed the gray surface, in places crossed by the linear crevices of basins and low mountains. The tapes of the films shot directly from the devices stretched to a magnification sufficient to make out individual stones. The round flight did not give the slightest evidence that intelligent beings had ever settled on this satellite. They even tracked down the Cephians, bomb station comfortably nestled in a half-circle carved into a steep precipice of effervescent luminous lava. In this convenient place, protected from meteorites, on the second orbit of flight, the dark flame descended towards the bomb station, announcing in the language of the circle that the DBS of the Earth had arrived here on a special mission and would be landing on the planet. The continued operation of a station for more than 5 years from the moment of dispatch signified the death of a starship. For that reason, the planet ST-3388+04ZF Earth had requested a report along the circle at the earliest opportunity. "Just not to forget to turn it off on the way back," said Div Symbol with concern. "Such cases have also happened in the throes of joy when fleeing from dangerous planets." "Ours has a safety device," Sol Cyan assured. "There is an additional circuit. When we move away from Tormans and its satellite, the station will emit a howl until we deactivate it. Then everything is ready." "It's time to go to Tormans," the pilot engineer said with a yawn. "We have time to relax." Phi Rotis warned us to approach the planet as slowly as possible, from the sun-facing side, without using locators or signaling. "Sneaking up like the ancient hunters on the beast." So Cyan grinned, displeased. "You don't like it?" Div Symbol was surprised. "There is something not good in this, to hide, to creep up secretly." Phi Rotis spoke of the need not to disturb the inhabitants of Tormans. If they are hostile towards guests from outer space, the arrival of the dark flame will cause outrage, and we will have to orbit the planet for 1 or 2 months while we learn the language and familiarize ourselves with the customs. If they find out about a starship flying over their planet, then now we will not even be able to explain why we are here. But the Cephians explained, probably having memorized 1 or 2 phrases. And they were denied. "We cannot be denied. The path was too far, and Tormans is our destination, not a planet noticed in passing," said Div Symbol. "Does it not look like an indiscreet spying around the corner?" Sol San would not let up methods fit for ancient peoples, but not for the highest form of society. And here is our sociologist. "What do you think, Chetty?" The cybernetics engineer recounted the discussion. She thought for a moment, then resolutely announced, "It would not be worthy of the people of Earth in our era if we appeared, spied, and quietly returned. We would do no harm, but it is to peer into the room of a person while he suspects nothing. We will explain when we go down to the planet, and they will understand. And if they do not understand and do not accept?" persisted Sol Sane, scoffingly squinting. "I'm not sure how I would decide." "I agree with Rotis." "And I think the same," said the pilot engineer. "Especially since you both lose sight of an essential detail. From the tremendous height at which we can conduct a stable orbital flight, we can observe only the most general details of the life of the planet. And we can only catch those transmissions that were designed for the whole planet. In other words, we will see and hear only open social life. And we don't need anything else to understand their language and norms of behavior." "That's right, Div. I didn't grasp this simple thing straight away." "What say ye, Sol?" The cybernetic engineer threw up his hands, agreeing. "And one more thing," continued Div Symbol. "They do not have advanced artificial satellites, so we will not violate anything in the system of their communication." Saying, Or perhaps there are no satellites at all, advanced or no, asked Sol. Soon we will find out.